Oh, it is on. Okay. The Korean Cultural Center has this tradition where I get to give like a quick pop quiz. And so I'm going to ask some random question, and don't just blurt it out. Raise your hand, and let me see. I need some people to like help me figure out who raised their hand first. Maybe some can help. Okay. So the question is, okay, what are the two South Korean automakers?
Hyundai and Kia.
Okay, Hyundai and Kia, so you get a prize. Thank you. So this is how we check to see if we're paying attention. Okay, now this is my second talk of the week, and I'm talking about early Korea, so pre-modern Korea. Okay, key points. I know it's dense. Okay, point number one. People have been living in East Asia since Paleolithic times, and it really was a long process for them to develop into distinct countries. So when we talk about early pre-modern Korea, there's no sense, or even in East Asia, there's really no sense of countries back then. Their development really was a lot, sure there's autonomy, but also a lot of shared cultures, because even in pre-modern times, ideas, material goods, people managed to travel around. And Korea is not just a transmitter, but also really helped produce this. In fact, when I taught a year-long course on East Asia, I used to talk about different eras of globalization. You know, for example, Buddhism, Confucianism. Even in pre-modern times, it's not, even before K-pop, there was globalization. Okay. So first about the rise of civilization. So during the Paleolithic period, starting from about, about the 15,000 before present, people used chipstone tools. And it's pretty much like any other human civilization. Figured out how to use stone tools. Here's a stone scraper. And in Neolithic times, they started, we see more evidence of dwellings. Now, shamanism was really big in Korea. And it's this belief that there are spirits all around us. Spirits live in mountains, trees, rocks. All natural objects have spirits. And dead spirits are all around us. So everyone who's ever lived, their spirit is everywhere. And the spirits can either be helpful to us or harm us. And shamans are people who are intermediaries between the spirit world and our human world. And shamans use song and dance to evoke spirits. Now, early settlers on the Korean Peninsula actually came from the Siberian region. And the people who started out in Siberia, some went, ended up in the Korean Peninsula, others went to Central Asia, and some actually crossed over the Bering Strait and ended up in Alaska. And so I was talking with some people from Alaska last week, and they say there are so many similarities. One of them was a teacher in Alaska, and he said that there are certain smaller language groups in Alaska, and the grammar sounds just like Korean. It's the same order. Like if they explain that, the students are like, I get that. Because, Korean is an evolutive language, and the word order in a sentence is like in Korean in some Eskimo languages. Actually, I'm told that Eskimo is actually now a derogatory language. Huh? Inuit. Although, is that apply to everybody, or is that one group?
I'm not sure, but we use Inuit for the language.
So, and early shamans had multiple roles. So they were priests and priestesses, they were healers, and also diviners who foretold the future. So this is a contemporary shaman ceremony there. And these are just some of the Neolithic sites that have been found. It doesn't mean that people only lived in these areas, but this is where they have dwellings. In Neolithic times, people lived in, semi-subterranean, so not fully dug in, but lower than regular ground level. We see the cone pattern pottery. You'll see an example of that downstairs, a replica. People lived in smaller gatherings because, it's a lot of people to feed. You can't have, 100,000 people living together. They were hunters, fishers, hunters and gatherers. And this is an example of a reconstruction of a Neolithic dwelling. Inside, there are a lot of these post holes and the fire pits in the middle. An example of comb pattern pottery. I think archaeologists have the least imaginative names for things. That is comb pattern pottery. And one of the things is it's conical, so you need some kind of a stand or perhaps these holes where you can hold it, otherwise it'll just topple over. And this is from a museum. It just shows you some of the stone tools, how they lived. People fished, hunted, gathered, and some early form of agriculture. Now, the mythical origins of the Korean people. You ask any Korean person and they will say it was Tangun Hwabaek. And who is this Tangun Hwabaek? Well, he supposedly founded Korea in 2333 BCE, and he was the son of the Lord of Heaven. And he told his dad, like many young people wanted to go forth and have their own lives, said, hey, I really want to, love home, but I want to go and, find my own way. And so his dad sent him down and just, if you're the Lord of Heaven, you don't send your kid with a backpack. Sent him down with thousands of followers. So he came down to Earth, Korea of all places, and he came upon a talking bear and a tiger because, hey, it's a myth, so they talk. So this bear and the tiger asked him to transform them into humans, and he said, okay, go live in a cave for 100 days, only eat raw garlic, not the fancy sauteed stuff in pasta, and wormwood or, this is very bitter herb. So the tiger gave up, because the tiger doesn't have as much patience, but the bear persevered and was transformed into a woman. And story says, a beautiful woman at that. Was all happy, but then she was like, oh wait, I'm a little lonely. And then the son of the Lord of Heaven transformed himself into a man, and together they had a child who became known as Tangun and was the founder of Korea. So that is the son of the Lord of Heaven coming down with all the followers. That's the bear and the tiger. He is offering them only the garlic and the mugwort or the wormwood. They have the baby who becomes Tangun Hwabaek. Hwabaek means grandfather, but he's the... Huh? Tiger stayed a tiger. And here's a statue of Tangun. Another statue of Tangun. This is actually in a shrine. And this is, I think, the most interesting statue of Tangun. Where do you think that one is? Seoul? But look, you can't, I don't know if you can see it, but there's a lot of red clay on them hills. And notice, that's not Korean, right? Close, Arizona. You go outside of Sedona and take this dirt road where your rental car company actually tells you not to go on dirt roads, and you do it anyway, and you can end up at this place and see this statue of Tangun.
Why was there?
There's something called the Tan retreat there, and it's like a meditation retreat, but they kind of put a lot of importance on Tangun. So
Was he real or is this mythical?
mythical. Now, I talked about the Siberian origins of the Korean people, and so even later on you see some of the bronze culture that came from that region. And as people developed agriculture, they realized, hey, this land is pretty useful. So instead of being nomadic, people started settling, and land became hereditary. And over time, they had social stratification, because when there are hunters and gatherers, there tends to be more equality. And they found more bronze objects. They find a lot of these in graves, petroglyphs. And this is a dolmen, and this is from Gangwon Island, which is off the west coast of Korea, but it is a northern-style tabletop dolmen, and these marked burial sites of leaders, tribal leaders. And if you're wondering, how did they get that up there? See how they rolled it and then used, what do you call that, like livers. get it up there. And notice similarities across many different cultures. So this is, as you can see, Ireland, the Netherlands, Portugal, France, Russia, Spain. And so many different cultures use these kind of stone structures to mark graves. And then aside from the bronze culture, they also got iron culture from China. And they continue to use bronze goods because they have different uses. Iron, is very strong and sturdy, but doesn't, wouldn't make for example, the sword tips as well as bronze does. And we see that with this, there's greater stratification of society. Whoops, too fast. So here we see more things found in graves that there's both iron, well, these are iron tools here, and agriculture. So people started settling down more with agriculture, became, as I said before, inheritance, and rice comes quite later in agricultural history, but earlier on were things like millet. And we see how there were contacts within East Asia. People learned to farm different things, and develop agriculture through contacts with other people who figured it out first. This map shows you the different stages. So this is Old Joseon, the kingdom that was mythically founded by the son of the Lord of the son of the Lord, the grandson of the Lord of Heaven and the Bear Woman. And then we have the Three Kingdoms period, Silla rising up, then Silla with the northern kingdom of Pare, Goryeo, and then Joseon. So the Three Kingdoms period. The Three Kingdoms were Goguryeo, Baekje, and Silla, but there's also a confederated kingdom that didn't last as long, which is kind of ironic, because when we think about it, 500 plus years still sounds like a long time, but for Korean history, Gaya didn't last as long. Okay. Goguryeo was the largest of the Three Kingdoms, the northernmost, and they had not only to deal with their neighbors on the Korean peninsula, but also the so-called barbarians to the north. And so anytime, you have three, whether it's three best friends, three siblings, the alliances shift a lot. Baekje was in the southwest, and although you might think the southeast is closer to Japan, it was Baekje that had the closest ties with Japan. And in fact, some people migrated to Japan, and some of them went unwillingly. Gaya was the confederated kingdom, 6 separate small states. Gaya was the smallest of the, Gaya is like the 4th kingdom, but it was smaller than the other 3, and even then it was 6 separate states that were confederated together. It was the first one to be defeated. Silla lasted the longest of the 3 kingdoms, and initially they actually turned to Tang China to ally with Tang China to defeat its neighbors, but then they ousted the Tang. And because Silla won, we tend to see history from the Silla point of view. Silla had something called a bone rank system, and this was their social status system. And up top were the hallowed bones, hallowed meaning sacred or holy, and they were the ones who were eligible for the crown. So initially they didn't have father and son succession, it was just anybody who was a holy bone would be picked as a first among equals. And then were the true bones. And then the head rank 6 through 1. Now, a child took the rank of the lower ranking parent. It didn't matter, they didn't just go by the father, because the father could rank lower than the mother. They took always the lower ranking parent, and there were a lot of laws that said, what kind of house you could live in, how big a house, what kind of horse trappings, what kind of clothes, even dictating what kind of spoon and chopsticks you could have. So there were strict sumptuary laws that made sure that you knew which status you were in. And the hallowed bones died out because of the rigidity of the system. There was also the Hwabaek Council of Nobles, and this is how the aristocrats balanced out the king's power. The king was really a first among equals, and the Hwabaek Council were the aristocrats, and they had a really interesting set of checks and balances. Now, the aristocratic council had to agree unanimously. So if they wanted to declare war, the king couldn't do that. The king had to go to the aristocratic council and get their unanimous vote. And so they didn't agree unanimously very often, which made sure that the king still had a certain degree of power. And they also had, it took them a few centuries to decide to adopt Buddhism as the official state religion. The other kingdoms didn't have the Council of Nobles, so they adopted Buddhism much earlier. It took longer for Silla. The Hwarang are flower youths, and these were aristocratic youths, originally co-ed, we think, later just males. And this is basically like, kind of, I don't know, I think the best way to describe it is like a college fraternity. They're supposed to be studying together, but there's a lot of partying going on. These were aristocratic youths who basically were the next generation of aristocratic leaders. So they spent their youths training together in the military arts, traveling, partying. And the Buddhism back then also had a lot of mysticism. So they were in search of things like immortality. Queen Seondeok, you saw a picture of her earlier. She was a queen who inherited the throne from her father because she was her father was the last of the male hallowed bones. And they then went through all the female hallowed bones before going to the true bones. So again, it shows how class is more important than gender. And she helped set the foundation for unifying Silla, and there are a lot of achievements under her reign. In fact, that observatory you saw was built during her reign, and then she was followed by a female cousin, Queen Seondeok. If you look at the Silla crowns, they're 24-karat gold with jade pieces. That's also interesting because later on in Korea they don't wear gold crowns anymore because Confucianism is about kind of modesty and austerity. But at this time you see the solid gold crowns, and also if you look, what animal does that kind of remind you of? Yeah, what? Oh, yeah. You used the crane word before.
For some reason, English is
like a deer with antlers, right? And this is also, we think, a throwback to the shaman origins, from the Siberian origins and the shamans whose headgear kind of also had animal forms like that. The observatory from Silla. What's really interesting is it has 27 layers. Queen Seondeok was the 27th monarch of Silla. And guess how many stones there are? No, there are more than 27 stones. Oh, no, 365. And they also say that it has kind of a different shape because Queen Seondeok was a woman, kind of showed, it's more like, she would be in a skirt. Okay. Now the three kingdoms, China and Japan, really work well with the 6th and 7th grade standards. Do we have any 6th and 7th grade teachers here? Oh, a few, okay. So you can talk about the Silk Road, Buddhism and Confucianism, and also I hope you emphasize that in terms of Korea was not just an imitator of China, rather there was really a lively exchange of culture and scholarship in East Asia. In fact, this is a piece of Syrian glass that was found on the Korean peninsula. And in fact, there's a very early mention in an Arab book that talks about this faraway kingdom of El Silla. So there were exchanges. Of course, not every day, but you see that the Silk Road really did facilitate exchange of culture. Okay. So in terms of aristocratic culture, all of the East Asian countries, China, Japan, Korea, and Vietnam, used classical Chinese or literary Chinese as the official writing system. It's kind of like in Europe when they used Greek or Latin. And Buddhism, again, was not just an eastward transmission, but Korean monks also really helped develop Buddhist thought. Material culture, again, through the Silk Road and beyond, we see how East Asia exchanged goods and ideas, and there was trade. People in other countries also valued luxury goods from the other East Asian countries, minerals like silver, copper, timber, steel swords. And unified Silla, there was a rise of maritime trade. And so one of the ways to get really rich at this time was if you had ships and you were trading. And then there's a really interesting work, you can just Google it, it's available readily, Cameron Hirst. It's called The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And it's a really old article, 1981, but still very relevant. So it talks about the three leaders, Bunye, who founded later Goguryeo, Hyunwon, who founded later Baekje, and Wanggun, who ended up taking the throne from later Goguryeo. But it talks about, it characterizes them as the good, bad, and then the ugly, because that's how history came to identify them. And Hirst talks about how, history is written by the victors and puts it in terms that really is, I think, very applicable for, like, if you teach AP World History or something. And it's a very short piece. But it talks about how history is really rewritten depending on who wins it. Because, the victor is always seen as the good guy. And it says, Hirst says that this guy wasn't that ugly, this guy wasn't that bad, and this guy wasn't that good.
That's also the name of the
Yes. I'm sure that's why I used it, because it's catchy. Okay, so Goryeo was founded by Wanggun. He usurped the throne, but he had to justify him taking the role. And he also needed to make sure that he wasn't going to be a one-shot king and that his descendants would continue to have control. Now, he got to power by getting the support of local warlords who had private armies. But the way that he kept the local warlords from then, turning on him was he ended up with a total of 29 wives. So he basically cemented ties with the local warlords by marrying their daughters. Buddhism and Confucianism, as I said, are 6th and 7th grade standards. The civil service examinations in Korea were based on the Chinese model. Buddhism was very important. In fact, if we look at this time period in Korea, it's a lot like the Catholic Church in Europe. So aristocrats would send their son into the clergy, and then to make sure that their sons weren't suffering too much, they would make donations to the church, well, to the Buddhist temples, give them gold, land, slaves, and the temples had tax-exempt status. And this is, if you remember from European history, how some of the popes were quite corrupt, were having illegitimate sons. Same thing was happening in Korea with the Buddhist temples. I showed you the woodblock prints, 81,000 plus, and this, which marked the entirety of the East Asian Buddhist canon at the time. It is. So everything that they knew, all the written Buddhist texts at the time were recarved at this point. So it was like the most complete library, but not just library, they could print multiple sets there.
So is each block like actually that big and they carved into it, or is it a book?
Oh, each one is like a page, like this big.
And that big?
Yes.
Oh, wow.
Were they the only ones writing at this time?
No, Buddhist monks love to share their ideas. So a lot of these might be just handwritten, but also they made printed woodblock prints as well. And then later movable metal type. Okay. Now Korea also had a period of military rule, of feudalism. And one of my pet peeves as a history teacher is when people misuse the term feudal. But, feudalism really should be a time where you have, military rulers who are not taking over as king, but, like in the British feudal system. But, people often use the term feudal to mean anything old. I was at a funeral in September, and the decedent's niece was saying, my aunt grew up in feudal Korea, and I was like, she's not that old. So 1170, there was a military coup because military officials and civil officials were supposed to be equally important. But the civil officials thought they were more important because, hey, they're more literate than the military officials. So finally, they were mistreated. The military officials had a coup, and they enthroned a king whom they could control, and then had a brief century of military rule. And during this time, the military were in power, but they didn't get rid of the civil officials. They realized that they were still useful for managing the government. They had a king whom they could control. So there was this brief period, about a century, of true feudal rule in Korea. I'm not going to go over all the details there. Okay, and during this time, they also had peasant and slave rebellions, which is really interesting because it's so long ago. Now, the reason they were having this is not because Koreans suddenly thought, hey, slavery is wrong. What happened is the Che house that took consolidated rule, they had a lot of private armies, private soldiers, and one of the things that people used to do is, you can't just always have volunteer soldiers, so you have slaves who you make into soldiers. And the Che family was quite different in that they recognized capable military leaders. So even if it was a slave, if they were strong in battle and had distinguished themselves, the Che family elevated them, freed them, and then elevated them. And that's why you had these slave revolts, because they're like, hey, that guy wasn't the one who came up with that idea, that was my idea. He shouldn't get credit. And so that's why there were these revolts, and also by peasants, a lot of uprisings. Okay. And then the military period ended because of the Mongol rule. The Mongols had the largest contiguous empire in world history, and Goryeo became the son-in-law nation. So Genghis Khan, you may have heard of him, or Kublai Khan, his grandson. So they invaded Korea, but ironically, the military leaders were had gotten soft by then. So instead of staying and fighting the Mongols, they fled with the royal family to Kangwa Island, which did not make them very popular. So it was the peasants, lowborns, they're fighting the Mongols, and the Mongols really slaughtered a lot of people. Also took many people hostage back to Mongol China, and they're the ones who burned the first set of the wood blocks, and then finally the king sued for peace. And look at how large the Mongol Empire was. Really big. Who's read The Kite Runner? Oh, many of you. Teachers love that. So if you remember from The Kite Runner, remember the, well, okay, spoiler alert, remember the half-brother? And his family had actually been descended from the Mongols. They had gone as conquerors, but those who stayed behind ended up actually becoming oppressed. So, okay. So the Mongol Empire was also unique in that it was the first time, second time would be with the Manchus, that foreigners had gone in and taken over China. So the Mongols were seen as barbarians, yet they had the strength, military strength, to go in and conquer China. And it was during this time that Marco Polo had gone to China and described, amazing cultural riches, the cities, and that was when it was. And the Mongols were, had this huge empire, and they needed to navigate great distances, so they were really advanced in astronomy. They had roads, postal stations, because the government needed to communicate throughout this huge empire. Advances in medicine, all these other things. And they promoted trade within the Mongol Empire. So this is a really important time. Here is a trade ship that's in the National Museum, and it shows some of the things. It was sunk and then they found it, so it shows you replicas of what they found. And Goryeo, as I said, became a son-in-law kingdom. And the aristocrats wanted ties with the Mongols because they were bigger and stronger. So there were many foreigners in Goryeo, but also many Koreans who went to the Mongol capital. And all of the kings of Goryeo during this time became son-in-laws. So they married Mongol princesses, were actually raised in the Mongol capital until it was time for them to come to Korea and rule as kings. And so, as you can imagine, over very quickly, the first guy is half Mongol, then the next one becomes 3/4 Mongol, yet they're still seen as Korean. The Mongols also demanded a lot of tribute, everything from really people to horses to silver and furs, all sorts of things. And the Mongols also mobilized Koreans to fight against the Japanese. the Mongol capital was called Daegu, but it's Beijing today, was really the center of culture. And because it was also where many Korean elites went, there are also many Korean women there. In fact, it became very popular to have Korean mistresses. And one of these actually elevated herself all the way to Empress. And also because there were so many Korean women there, there's also a real interest in Korean fashion. So you can call this the early, version of the Korean wave. Queen Noguk was King Kongmin's Mongol wife, but they say that she was, she loved her adopted country, and how when she died in childbirth, her husband became very depressed, despondent. And on the other hand, it was a Korean woman who, as I said, became empress, yet she was really vilified in Korea, especially later. They said she was ruthless and all of that. So this is the Mongol princess. This is from the drama. So the queen, their tombs. And this is Empress Ki. You might think, this is one painting of her. You might think, how could she have, been so conniving and all of that? And a different picture of her. And then the drama makes her look like that, because, And then we go into the final kingdom of Joseon. So Lee Seong-gi established Joseon. Now, instead of taking on 28 extra wives, what he did is he made people dynastic foundation marriage subjects. So it's like this, fancy title he gave to his supporters. One of the early kings, King Sejong, one of the few kings known as the Great, he appointed some of his scholars to come up with this phonetic writing system. Also a lot of print culture, a lot of books published under his reign, and also astronomy, geography, technology. So the Korean alphabet, as I said, they say it can be learned in one morning. At the time, they didn't call it Hangeul, which is what it's called today, Korean writing. At the time, it was called proper sounds to instruct the people. So important to have good brand marketing. They didn't have that. The idea was, I don't know that it really was because King Sejong was so benevolent. There's the other side of having a literate population is also you get to control them. They don't have an excuse for not knowing what the laws are if they're literate. But he, did publish many, or under his reign they had many different books published. This is an example of explaining the new vernacular writing system. So one version explains it in the modern Korean, and then one version explained it in literary Chinese. But what's really interesting is here is Hangeul down here, and this is Phagspa, which was one of the Mongol writing systems. The Mongols had multiple different alphabets, but this is one system, and people say, look at the similarities. This is one of the books that was published under King Sejong's reign. More different examples of the books. And they still had a lot of books published in literary Chinese. Now the elites didn't want to give up literary Chinese. They thought that it was much more refined and civilized, like in Europe, with Latin and Greek. So the aristocrats wanted to keep literary Chinese as the official writing, but for women and commoners, the vernacular writing became popular. Don't worry about the details, but lots of different books. This explains the three bonds, which is a Confucian idea, that the subject must be loyal to the ruler, that the wife must be separate from the husband, and the child must be filial to the parent. Now, this idea of separation might be like, wait, husband and wife should be separate? They needed separate spheres of influence. So the husband was not to meddle in the wife's affairs, and the wife was not to meddle in the husband's affairs. So that's what the separation is. A lot of different geographies, and I'm sure Christine could tell you a lot more about that, but if I might just try to interject myself in her area of expertise. In terms of the geographies, they're really very detailed. In grad school, we had to take these classes, and I was just amazed at the level of detail in the geography. So like you look up a certain mountain and it tells you everything from, you know, the features, the land area, all the checkpoints, fortifications, population, so, you know, different villages that are there, native products, roads, you know, so much detail that went in. It's kind of like looking at, you know, Wikipedia today, but more accurate. So this is a map of the Korean Peninsula that they did at that time, a map of Seoul. And also a lot of different scientific advances at that time. This is a rain gauge, a wind streamer, an astronomical clock, also on the 10,000 won bill, sundial, water clock, another drawing of that, and many different books, even on medicine, military affairs. And I talked about Lee Sun-shin before in that film, Warring Currents. So Lee Sun-shin was a general, and most often he's famous for his turtle boats, which do not appear in that film, by the way, Admiral Warring Currents, because he hadn't quite developed it yet, and they didn't have enough of those. But, you know, the film tells you many times that Lee Sun-shin had a better victory record than Admiral Nelson even. It's a painting of him, picture of a replica of a turtle boat. Now, no actual turtle boats have survived, they're just descriptions. The film, Warring Currents. The film again. And this is where it took place. And you can see how with just 12 Korean ships, he was able to defeat 330 Japanese ships, according to the film, because he picked a strategic location where all of the Japanese armada would have to go through a narrow area, and so they were able to defeat them. And this is why he's supposed to be such a good strategist. Okay. Now, in Joseon, the Yangban, the scholar officials, were up highest, and the civil officials were higher than the military officials, and then were the secondary status groups. And the secondary status groups weren't aristocrats. They were in many cases descendants of the aristocrats through concubines. So if your mother was a concubine, even if your father was an aristocrat, you didn't get to be an aristocrat. You qualified as the secondary status group. They're also technical officials, local functionaries. So they're like the people who did the actual work in the government. Like when you go to DMV, the young one might be the people whose pictures are on the walls, but the people actually doing the work would be the secondary status group. And then were the peasants. And even the peasants were stratified. So the farmers, because of their hard work, were up higher than the artisans. Artisans, you know, made pots and pans and things that we all need, but we all know how hard farming is. And then the merchants are the lowest of the commoners because they sell other people's hard work. Profit off that. And then the lowborn. So Korea had outcasts, which included entertainers, various different despised occupations like butchers, grave diggers, leather tanners. These were despised occupations. And then beneath them were slaves. Now there was a lot of discussion among Confucians for many centuries about whether slavery should be hereditary or not. According, earlier on, slaves were supposed to be basically criminals who had committed crimes but not bad enough to be executed. So by becoming enslaved. But then they said that shouldn't be hereditary because the father's sins shouldn't pass on to the children. Another way that they had slaves was through, battles. That if your village was taken over, then everybody in there, would become spoils of war. And so there was a lot of historical debate about what slavery should entail and whether it should be hereditary or not. Over time, though, in Korea, many of the slaves either bought their freedom or ran away. And over time, the number of slaves declined. Okay. So I talked about Sunsin earlier. She was the second of 5 daughters, a very prominent family on both the mother's side and the father's side. As I said before, she was a noted artist. You saw her paintings on her bill as well as her son's bill. And we have Madam Shin's mother's will, and it details all of the mother's separate property that she had brought with her, and the mother also talks about how she wants her property divided up. And at this time in Korea, if you didn't have a son, that was perfectly fine. They didn't adopt in a son. She did appoint her Madam Shin's third son, not even the eldest son, but the third son, the one who became the famous scholar, to be the ritual heir. So he got his own inheritance so that he continued to have like the Chesa ceremonies that you saw. There's a picture of her. And what we see after this, starting in 1644, is a greater Confucianization. Although Confucianism went into Korea much earlier, they hadn't just adopted pieces of it. But in 1644, when the Manchus took over Korea, the Koreans said, oh no, the barbarians have taken over again. We'd better uphold Confucianism and keep it so that when the Chinese reclaim China, we can teach them what Confucianism is. So the Koreans in 1644 decided to become the last bastion of civilization. And so they really ramped up their Confucian ideology and changed, and a lot of social customs changed as well. So this is when women didn't have the same kind of privileges. So although women used to live with their own families after getting married, or at least initially, they were moving into their husband's home earlier. The wedding ceremonies continued to be at the bride's house in Korea, although the Chinese custom was not so because of the whole long tradition of women living with their own families in Korea. Now, for the royal family, what they did is they kind of modified it. So they moved in the future daughter-in-law and her immediate family, or her parents, onto the palace, gave them one of the houses on the palace grounds, and then the wedding was there. So it was technically within the palace, but it also had that semblance of being at the bride's house. So as women moved out of their natal houses, I suppose their brothers complained, and women only got 1/3 of the inheritance that their brothers did. But they also only had 1/3 of the responsibility. So for example, whereas a son was supposed to mourn for his parents for 3 years, a daughter now only mourned for 1 year, which is a direct correlation with her reduced inheritance. And there was relative peace in Korea all the way to the 19th century, a lot of factionalism and then strong in-law families. But overall, so pre-modern Korea has very distinct origins. Korea was not founded by the Chinese, was not an exact copy of the Chinese. And Korea developed both on its own, but also with a lot of exchanges with its neighbors, China, Japan, Vietnam. And Korea was not just passively receiving culture. It was part of a very active era or exchange of information, culture, and goods. So Korea produced, contributed, and exchanged culture with its neighbors and even further beyond. And Korea has a very important role in the historical development of Korea. Now, we've got extra time left, and what I really would like to do is talk about how you might bring Korea into your classroom. So whatever level you teach, for example, we can talk about not just pre-modern Korea, but what are ways that you already incorporate Korea? What are some ways that maybe you're thinking you might? So let's have some share time over here about your best practices, questions or ideas. And certainly, even if you teach lower grades. Oh, can I ask? Okay. Let's start with who teaches high school? Okay. And for those of you teaching high school, do you teach how many of you teach AP courses? Okay. Who teaches middle school? Ooh, a lot. Elementary school? Oh, a lot of you as well. So really, I think at every level, even in kindergarten, we could talk about some of the stories. Like one of my favorite units that people do in the lower grades is, Cinderella stories around the world. Things like that. So let's talk about the different ways that you might bring Korea into the classroom. Ideas, questions? Yes?
Well, for my grade level team, we bring it in the beginning when we were talking about names of children, how children, like in Korea, for some Korean family, they have a Korean name and an American name. We also bring it in about when we're learning the alphabets and really doing things like this, and of course through literature.
That's a good idea. What kind of literature?
We do fairy tales. We do fairy tales and folk tales, and we look at the different cultures around the world and how they bring in certain themes, fairy tales, folk tales, what they mean, so children can clearly identify it. And then we exchange like full names, and we choose a country, and they have to sort of like come up with their own story, whether in a group or a team, translating their story into a different culture.
That's great. Who else? Oh, come on, teachers are not shy about talking.
Hi, I teach little 3 to 5 year old special ed students, and I love doing science kind of things, and I would talk to them about the inventions, like the sundial and the rain, what was it called?
Rain gauge.
The rain gauge and the wind streamer, and then I would have us create our own, so that they could then see what it was like, and how does it work?
Great idea. Who else? Don't be shy. Yes.
I teach adults and frequently had very mixed classes, so for every country I try to find something positive, whatever it was. It didn't matter, but with Korea I used the turtle boats and also the heating system, forced air heating system, because in fact it's very modern, but it was discovered a long time ago in China and Korea.
Who else? Yes.
I teach TP through second for autism, and my students love music, so we incorporated arena through Ping Pong, which was like a very visual but modernized version of a traditional song.
So I teach Korean and music, and so I had like my Korean students all like learn the arena, and also my music kids also sing arena, and then I had like a special Korean drumming group and my vocal ensemble. So I had this one awesome moment. There was only 3 Korean heritage students on stage, maybe like 60, 70 kids, and on the front row there was my Korean drummers, and then the back of my vocal ensemble singing the whole arena in one little 2-minute snippet of the Korean drum routine. So it was just like hearing arena along with the drum was just really awesome for me, and then just how it just opens up students learning about other cultures, and through learning the Korean culture, and then it opens them up to other and get curious about other cultures as well.
And I have to say, Ms. Kong, very unusual job description in that she teaches Korean language, Korean culture, and music and vocals at North Hollywood High School. And she really integrates it really well. And there are a lot of movies that you've shown where there are Korean and music themed, and that students really enjoy. Who else? Come on, back row. Don't be like back row students. Michelle, yes, you said for my
I think that I haven't done this yet, but I'm planning on doing like a lot of art integration with like Korean, and how similar like the shape of Korea, like the Korean peninsula, is with other parts of like the United States or even parts of California, and maybe they can do an art project where they can study the letters, the Korean letters. So that's my plan.
Who else? Yes.
This past year we had an oral history project, so I challenged the kids to find a cultural marker that they've grown up with, but they've never really asked why they celebrate the food that they eat or the clothing that they wear. And so they had to go home and choose a parent or a grandparent or even an older sibling to explain the significance of that particular object, and that worked really, really well. And we all got hungry because we wanted to eat all the food that they were talking about.
And you bring up a really good point. Food is a an amazing way to teach about cultures and, commonalities, as well as differences. So who else? Yes.
Hello. In high school, I teach speech and debate, and so obviously this year we've been talking a lot about the likelihood of nuclear attacks and whether a nuclear attack on the part of the U.S. should be completely off the table, and following the summit, and so that more talking about current events.
And then I'll
So with the Olympics, Ms. Shen and I, we actually got to come to the Culture Center, and then we got to talk about the Korean Olympics and like hosting the Olympics, and that really engaged my students because they're very interested in sports. And then that kind of like trickled on to learning more about Korean culture, and I like to show my kids Kids Try videos on YouTube, and they did a segment on Korean snacks, and so they got to watch kids like them try Korean snacks, and they got super engaged, and so my class ended up falling in love with choco pies this year because they got to actually try it and learn more about Korean culture. And I was also a Korean teacher, and like they probably never interacted with Koreans before, so I think it was just interesting having somebody who grew up that way as a kid and being able to learn firsthand about what it was like.
Where are you from?
No, you're at Brockton?
Oh yeah, I teach at Brockton.
Okay, there's a
In the Korean language, when you're learning it, the characters and things like that, are there stories that go along with learning them?
Linguistically, they say that it represents the different shapes of your mouth, but an easier way to learn mnemonics is there's this guy called Ryan Estrada, Google him, and he has these pictures, and like, for example, it's kind of not 100% accurate, but it says like the k sound, it's like a gun. What else? For view, it's like a bucket. So he has these mnemonics that make it easier, I think, for foreigners to learn. So
Yeah, I was
Ryan
curious.
Estrada.
Okay.
Not
Does it do the
American
same thing with
Estrada, but
Japanese?
Ryan Estrada. And then there's also a young woman who's too young to be a real professor, but it's called Professor O. She has a bunch of videos also that teach Korean language. What else? Anyone else? So we got 10 more minutes. Ask a question. Yes.
Hi, I'm Lily, and I teach at DePaul. So we have a business school, and they're mostly international studies and international students. So I teach about high constructs. But when you go to different countries, such as Japan and Korea, it's not about the hand movements or your gestures or how loud you talk. It's about how calm you are and how you speak and how you bow and about the environment and the meeting. So it's to like know different types of countries and how they conduct meetings.
That's a good idea. Plus. Yes.
How does a water clock work?
How does a water clock work? I don't know really. Yes.
What were the exchanges that Korea had with Vietnam?
Oh, okay. So Vietnam, that's a good question. So Vietnam is also part of this China-centered East Asian world. So the Vietnamese also use like the Chinese government system, the written language. And so, or at least in northern Vietnam anyway, they're able to be part of this. So, and also people say that they share a common culture through the Confucianism. In fact, one of the this is one of the reasons why Vietnamese brides moving to Korea, people were saying, oh, but there's so much that they share in their history. Although, ironically, as the Consul General said, South Korea sent 350,000 soldiers to fight in Vietnam, and South Korean soldiers were, some of them were quite brutal. They went there. I'll talk about this tomorrow, but when South Korea became an ally of the United States in the Vietnam War under the Brown Memorandum signed in 1966. South Korea, over the whole Vietnam War, sent about 350,000 soldiers to fight there. And the United States fully equipped them, paid for all of them, and also paid combat pay pay, equivalent of US combat pay, to the South Korean government, which did not make its way all the way to the soldiers. So South Korea got $1 billion worth of aid payments during the Vietnam War. And some of the Korean soldiers also, as happens in war, had practiced, they were very brutal. And so some of that is coming to the forefront now. So Korea and Vietnam, aside from the traditional culture, also had some, some of the ties during the Vietnam War as well, because South Korea, like the South Vietnamese, were, saw themselves in this Cold War. No, I think Koreans just love food. Yes? Okay. Yes. Okay, so the question is, how are the children treated, if their mother is Vietnamese, for example, and the father is Korean? Now, it is difficult. Some of the Korean or the bicultural children, have different linguistic problems, or they have experienced prejudice in society and in schools. So that's definitely there. When I asked my former student who was teaching at that rural school about it, he said, well, their school was so small. When you have 30 students in the whole elementary school, you really can't, ostracize half the school. You won't end up with enough friends. So he said in his school he thought there was less of that, but certainly that is a problem, and there are efforts in Korea to help bicultural children. And this is something that's really gone on since the Korean War. In fact, when South Korea started sending a lot of its orphans to be adopted abroad. Some of them were war orphans, some of them were biracial children born to Korean mothers, and soldiers, foreign soldiers stationed in Korea were fighting in the Korean War. And so, there has been a lot of discrimination against bicultural Koreans. Today, there's also many Koreans who, not just the Vietnamese moms, but also mothers who are Filipino. So there's a lot of things, and I think Korea is is trying to change, trying to be more welcoming, but I think it'll still take, some more time. But one of the things about South Koreans is they're incredible. Once they decide to do something as a society or as a country, the change comes so rapidly. I remember, I guess it was about 30 years ago, South Korea said, you know what, we're a small country, and, people liked having, burial sites. Before people used to have private family burial sites, they said, okay, we're going to start cremating. And at first people were like, that's not Confucian, that's not right. But in South Korea, they have embraced that so quickly. Some of the different things happening that I think, certain things in terms of, LGBTQ rights, I wouldn't be surprised if Korea embraces it earlier than the United States. Yes, he was. Heinz Ward, former retired Pittsburgh Steeler, former MVP. His mom was Korean, his dad was African American, and he really has done a lot to help biracial children in Korea. Yes?
So you can make a connection between dead and dead, and also the things that were mentioning earlier. I'm sorry for when you go to the cemetery and you have a meal and you form the ancestors of all the events of the family, they really are the same thing. And the explanation is that 3,000 years ago, Asian immigrants came to America, the ancestors of Mexican
That I don't know. I mean, certainly, the archaeological evidence is there for, Alaska, Not the Eskimos, but the Inuit. But I don't know about going all the way down to Central.
Mexico was conquered, and then the Spanish moved the celebration to right before Halloween in order to kind of weaken the whole European which is